Today, I'm going to tell you a story so haunting it lingers long after the final word. Set deep in the American West, where rivers roar, mountains stand silent, and mercy is never guaranteed. This is a land where fate collides with survival, and one wrong step can cost a life. It all began with a single cry carried by floodwater, a moment so small, yet powerful enough to pull two broken souls onto the same path. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The wide emptiness of Wyoming's high country was the medicine Caleb Rourke used to quiet pains he never learned how to name. It was 1874. The war had ended nearly 10 years earlier, yet its shadows still followed him through the thin mountain air. His cabin, low, rough-cut logs packed with clay and pine moss, stood only a short walk from the Wind River. Its back leaned against a wall of stubborn pines. Caleb had built the place with his own hands, raising it not as a home, but as a barrier, something solid to stand between himself and memory, between himself and a world that had taught him how easily men were discarded. He was tall, hardened by labor and long solitude. Sun and wind had carved his face into a record of survival. Fine creases framed eyes the color of gathering storms. His hands were thick with callus, steady and sure. Hands that once carried a rifle and now swung an axe without hesitation. He had marched under the Union flag, had watched fields like Gettysburg dissolve into mud and blood. Now he worked as a hired hand for a cattleman whose range lay half a day's ride away. He accepted wages, supplies, and one condition above all else: the right to be left alone. It suited both men. Town held no welcome for him. Lander was still young and restless, loud with gossip and judgment. To its people, Caleb was a Yankee, a man who had fought for the North in territory where loyalties had once been sharply divided. They saw someone who kept his past locked tight, who never lingered in saloons or bowed his head in their churches. His silence unsettled them. And in their eyes, Caleb recognized the same blind certainty that had sent boys, his own brother among them, into the jaws of war. Their quiet hostility was a constant ache. But the echo of artillery that visited his dreams cut far deeper. So he stayed close to the river and the mountains that demanded nothing from him. That spring had refused to release winter's grip. Snow still clung to the peaks well into May. Then June arrived with merciless sun. The thaw came hard and fast. The Wind River, once a clear ribbon of blue, turned violent, brown and raging, tearing at its banks and swallowing trees whole. Its roar filled the valley day and night. The old log bridge downstream was surely gone, meaning any supply run would require fording the shallows miles upstream. A gamble even for a skilled rider. Caleb was working near the corral, checking his horse's shoes. The scrape of the file against iron was steady, familiar, comforting. Then he heard something that did not belong. It was not the call of a hawk or the scream of a mountain cat. It was human, a thin, broken cry nearly devoured by the river's thunder. Caleb straightened, listening. For a heartbeat, he believed it was memory playing tricks again. Then it came once more, weaker, frantic. A woman's voice, edged with terror. His body moved before thought caught up. He dropped the file and sprinted toward the riverbank, long strides eating the ground. His eyes swept the chaos, branches, uprooted saplings, debris spinning violently downstream. That was when he saw her. A blur of dark cloth and pale skin, tangled in the limbs of a fallen cottonwood being hammered by the current. She was trapped, small and fragile against the river's fury. Caleb did not hesitate. There was no room for fear. Only the reflex of a man who had dragged wounded soldiers from gunfire. He kicked off his boots, tore free his gun belt, and plunged into the freezing water. The cold struck like a fist. It stole his breath, stabbed through his skin with ruthless force. The current seized his legs, dragging at him with savage strength. He fought forward, arms burning, eyes locked on her. This was no swim. It was combat. A floating log slammed into his shoulder, knocking the air from his lungs. He cursed, swallowed muddy water, and forced himself onward. As he closed the distance, her condition became clear. Her head barely stayed above the surface. Dark hair clung to her face. One arm clutched a thick branch while the river tried to tear the rest of her away. Something had her leg pinned beneath the surface. Her eyes were shut, her body slack with exhaustion. Caleb reached the cottonwood, gasping. Muscles screamed in protest. "Hold on!" he shouted, voice torn raw by wind and water. He hooked one arm around a solid limb to anchor himself. The entire tree groaned, threatening to break loose at any second. He grabbed her arm. It was icy and limp. Her dress was ripped, a bruise already blooming along her cheek. A soaked leather satchel was still looped around her wrist, held with the stubborn desperation of someone who had already lost too much. He took a breath and dove beneath the surface, fingers working blindly through swirling debris. His lungs burned. Panic pressed in. Then the branch shifted. He freed her leg and surged upward, dragging her with him. She collapsed against him, dead weight in the current. With everything he had left, Caleb fought his way back to shore. They hit the muddy bank together. He collapsed beside her, chest heaving, ears filled with the river's endless roar. She lay still. He rolled toward her and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse. Weak, but there. Then she coughed violently, river water spilling from her lips. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing green eyes clouded with fear. She stared at him as if he were another danger. "Easy," Caleb rasped. "You're safe." She tried to sit up, trembling uncontrollably. Her torn dress clung to her, and when she realized it, she gasped and pulled her arms tight across her chest. "Where am I?" she whispered through chattering teeth. "My land," he said, "near the Wind River." He stood, water streaming from his clothes. "You'll freeze out here. My cabin's close." When he reached for her, she recoiled, scrambling backward in the mud. "No," she said sharply. "Don't take me to town, please." The fear in her voice stopped him cold. "I'm not taking you to town," Caleb said, "but you won't survive this cold." She studied him, measuring one unknown danger against another. Finally, she nodded. When she tried to stand, her legs gave way. Without a word, Caleb lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, all bone and exhaustion. She stiffened, but did not resist. As he carried her toward the thin column of smoke rising from his chimney, he felt her shaking, and the heavy weight of that waterlogged satchel still hanging from her wrist. He reached for her, his fingers closing around her narrow, ice-cold arm. There was no reaction, no resistance, no sound. Her calico dress was ripped open at the shoulder, fabric torn and waterlogged. A deep bruise had already darkened along her cheekbone. The leather satchel she carried remained strapped to her wrist, soaked through and dragging heavily in the current. It was a desperate thing to cling to while death pressed so close. Caleb noticed her leg wedged tight between 2 submerged branches. Drawing in a breath, he ducked beneath the surface, the river swallowing him whole. His hands worked blindly through the freezing churn, fingers slipping across slick wood as he searched for the trap holding her fast. His lungs screamed, his chest burned. With a final violent pull, the branch shifted. He broke the surface, hauling her upward with him. Her body sagged completely now, boneless, lifeless in his grasp. Using what little strength remained, Caleb dragged her free of the snags and fought the river inch by inch. He stumbled onto the muddy bank, half carrying, half pulling her clear before collapsing beside her. His chest rose and fell in harsh gasps. For several long seconds, he could do nothing but lie there, the roar of the river pounding inside his skull. The woman lay motionless at his side, cold, silent. He turned toward her and pressed 2 fingers beneath her jaw. A pulse answered him, weak, fluttering, but alive. Then she coughed. The sound tore from her chest violently as water spilled from her mouth. Her eyes fluttered open, green as moss, clouded with pain and confusion. They locked onto him, wide with raw animal fear. "Easy," Caleb said hoarsely. "You're safe." She tried to push herself upright, but her body shook uncontrollably. When she realized the state of her clothing, she gasped and pulled her arms tight across her chest. Where am I?" she whispered, teeth chattering. "My land," he replied, "near the Wind River." He stood, soaked clothes clinging to him, the cold biting deep into his bones. "You've got to get warm. My cabin's close." He extended a hand. She recoiled instantly, scrambling backward through the mud like a frightened doe. "No," she said, breath trembling but firm. "Don't take me to town." The word please tore from her next, raw, panicked, filled with a fear far greater than the river itself. It stopped him cold. Caleb glanced toward the distant trail leading to Lander. He had no intention of going there, but she couldn't know that. "I'm not taking you to town," he said gruffly. "But you'll freeze out here. The cabin's your only chance." She studied him for a long moment, eyes searching his face, weighing danger against survival. Finally, she gave a faint nod. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. Without speaking, Caleb scooped her up into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, too light, too fragile. The sharpness of her bones felt wrong against his solid frame. Her body stiffened at his touch, yet she didn't fight him. As he carried her toward the thin trail of smoke rising from his chimney, he felt her trembling violently, and the heavy pull of the soaked satchel still hanging from her wrist. He shoved the cabin door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The single-room space was spare but orderly. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a small fire glowing within. A narrow cot rested at the back. A rough table and 2 chairs sat near the center. Shelves held canned food, a handful of books, and a neatly stacked row of ammunition. The scent of the place, wood smoke, coffee, and long solitude, hung in the air. That, more than anything else, seemed to unsettle her. She was an intrusion. They both knew it. Caleb lowered her gently into the chair nearest the fire. "Get the wet clothes off," he said. His back was already turned as he added wood to the flames. It wasn't a request. It was a practical order. He didn't look at her, granting what little privacy the tight space allowed. He moved to the stove and set a pot of coffee to boil, his hands performing the familiar motions on instinct. The routine steadied him. Silence thickened the room, broken only by popping firewood and the soft rattle of her teeth. "I won't be any trouble," she said at last. Her voice shook. "As soon as my clothes dry, I'll be gone." He grunted without turning. Her defensiveness bristled like thorns. It scraped against the solitude he guarded so fiercely, stirring irritation he hadn't asked for. He hadn't asked for a half-drowned woman with terror in her eyes to break the rhythm of his days. Yet, as he heard the quiet sound of wet fabric being peeled away, another feeling crept in, unwanted, unfamiliar. Curiosity. Who was she? And what was she running from that frightened her more than a river in flood? Caleb poured 2 tin cups of coffee, adding a heavy splash of whiskey from the bottle he kept for cold nights. He set one near her chair before stepping back into the shadows of the room. The heat from the fire fought the cold, and Caleb set 1 tin cup on the floor beside her chair before stepping back to the far end of the cabin. Only then did he allow himself to truly look at her. She sat wrapped tightly in his spare blanket. Her soaked dress and underthings were draped over the other chair, steam rising where the fire licked the air. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands, and the bruise on her cheek looked darker now against her pale skin. She cradled the coffee with both hands, drawing in its warmth, yet her eyes never left the flames. There was a faraway look in them, something restless and wounded. "My name's Caleb Rourke," he said at last. Speaking it aloud inside this cabin felt strange, as though he had broken an unspoken rule. She lifted her gaze. For the first time, her moss-green eyes met his without immediate panic. "May Holloway," she whispered. They sat in silence for a long while, sipping the bitter coffee. The whiskey dulled the ache in his limbs and softened the sharp corners of his thoughts. Caleb studied her quietly. He noticed the way her fingers tightened on the blanket without warning, the way she flinched whenever a log snapped in the hearth. She was carrying something heavy. "You should eat," he said, his voice gentler than he meant it to be. She shook her head. "I'm fine." "You're not," he replied evenly. "You nearly got carried off by that river." Her chin lifted slightly. "I'm thankful for what you did, Mr. Rourke," she said. "But I don't need anything else. I'll be gone by morning." "The river won't be down by morning," he answered. "Or the next day either. You're stuck here." The truth of it settled on her shoulders like a weight. Her posture sagged, the fight draining from her all at once. A single tear slipped free, cutting a clean trail through the dirt on her cheek. "My husband," she began, voice breaking. Caleb didn't interrupt. "He passed recently," she said after a breath. He was a gambler." She stared into the fire as though reading her life in the coals. "He left debts behind, bad ones." Her grip tightened on the blanket. "The men he owed came for the land, our homestead. They said it belonged to them now." Caleb remained still. He knew men like that well. In this country, debts were rarely collected with ink and signatures. "I had to run," she continued, barely louder than the fire. "I took what I could." Her eyes flicked toward the soaked satchel lying near the wall. "I rode through the night. I didn't know the river had risen so high." Her voice faltered. "My horse panicked halfway across." She shuddered. "It threw me." She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. A widow, a debtor, a woman with nowhere left to go. The West was full of stories like hers, a land that promised freedom and often delivered cruelty instead. Caleb felt something stir inside him, something he had buried long ago. Pity was dangerous. It opened doors best left closed. Outside, dusk bled purple and gray across the mountains. The cabin darkened until the fire was the only light. Caleb lit a lantern, its steady glow pushing the shadows back. He cooked a simple supper, beans and bacon. This time, when he set the plate before her, she ate. Slowly, mechanically, as though her body remembered the act, even if her spirit had not. When night fully settled, an uneasy silence crept between them. There was only one cot. "You take the bed," Caleb said, leaving no room for debate. "I'll sleep by the fire." She nodded, eyes lowered. "Thank you." He rolled out his blanket on the rough floor and lay down with his back to her. Still, he was painfully aware of every sound. The soft shift as she stood, the quiet catch of her breath. He stared into the dying embers, willing sleep to come. It didn't. Her presence filled the room. The cabin felt smaller, the air charged with something unfamiliar and unsettling. Then he heard her move again, bare feet whispering against the planks. He thought she was climbing into the cot. Instead, her voice drifted from the darkness, fragile, shaking, nearly lost beneath the wind outside. "Mr. Rourke." Caleb didn't turn, didn't answer. "What is it?" Caleb asked. A long silence followed. He could hear the uneven cadence of her breathing in the dark. "Your shirt," she said at last. "The one from the war, is it clean?" His brow creased as he stared into the shadows. The old Union shirt lay folded inside his trunk. Fabric worn thin at the elbows, its blue faded almost to ash gray. He'd kept it for reasons he'd never been able to name. "It is," he said. The pause that followed felt heavier than the first. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, stripped of its guarded edge, leaving only something exposed and trembling beneath. "Do you want to look at me?" The word struck him like a misfired shot. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He remained rigid, his back still turned, every muscle locked tight. She mistook his silence. "Will you stay? If I undress?" she whispered. In that question, Caleb heard the echo of 100 unspoken bargains. The shame, the surrender, the hollow exchange of a woman who believed her body was the only currency left to her. She was offering payment for the rescue, for the fire, for the food, for the roof above her head. Heat flooded his chest. Not desire alone, but something uglier. Anger at her. Anger at the men who had cornered her into believing this was expected. Anger at a world cruel enough to teach survival through humiliation. Beneath it all stirred a brief, unwanted spark of want, one he crushed instantly. He was a man. She was a woman. They were alone. But he was also a man who knew what it meant to be broken. Caleb turned his head just enough to glimpse her outline in the firelight. She stood clutching the blanket, slight and trembling against the vast dark of the room. Slowly, deliberately, he turned fully away, offering her nothing but the broad line of his back. He fixed his gaze on the glowing coals, jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Get some rest, May Holloway," he said quietly. "No one's going to touch you here." For a long while there was no sound at all. Then came the soft creak of the cot as she lay down. A moment later, a broken, muffled sob slipped free, one she tried and failed to contain. Caleb Rourke lay on the hard floor, listening to her quiet weeping and the unending thunder of the river beyond the walls. Something inside him cracked, just slightly, along the frozen defenses he'd spent years building. That confession lingered in the air long after the fire sank into dull embers. Sleep came thin and restless. He drifted in and out, aware of her breathing from the cot, ragged at first, then slow and even. She was there, present. A stone dropped into the still water of his life. Her vulnerability felt like an accusation, though he couldn't have said of what. When dawn finally broke, a bruised line of purple stretching over the mountains, Caleb was already awake, the coffee pot murmuring above a new flame. May did not rise until the sun stood fully in the sky. She moved carefully, stiffness in every step. A faint limp favored her right leg, the one caught in the river's grip. She kept her eyes down, the memory of the night before hanging over her like a heavy shawl. Shame lingered between them, hers for offering, his for understanding why she had. "The river's still too high," Caleb said, staring out the open doorway. It wasn't conversation. It was fact, solid and unmovable as the granite peaks surrounding them. The roar beyond the trees confirmed it. "I can see that," she replied softly. She gathered her dress from the chair where it had dried stiff and wrinkled. The fabric was thin, sun-faded, scarred now by river water, but she held it like armor. She stepped behind the blanket he'd strung up for privacy. When she emerged, she was once more May Holloway, fully dressed, if not yet whole. The days that followed slipped into a strange, unspoken pattern. The swollen river made leaving impossible, confining their world to the small stretch of land surrounding the cabin. May, he soon learned, could not endure idleness. On the second morning, he found her in the small garden patch, kneeling slowly as she pulled new weeds brought up by the snowmelt. Her movements were careful, her limp sharper after rising, but her hands were steady. "You don't need to do that," Caleb said, his shadow falling across the damp soil. She glanced up, lifting a hand to block the sun. "It's better than sitting," she replied. Then quieter, eyes returning to the earth. "I'm earning my keep." Caleb didn't argue. He understood the need for usefulness. He understood the dignity of work. Caleb left her to her work and returned to his own chores. He split firewood, reset a stretch of fence damaged by the thaw, and checked the small number of cattle grazing the high pasture. Yet no matter what task occupied his hands, his awareness of her pulsed quietly beneath his thoughts. More than once, he caught himself watching from a distance. He saw her limp down to the creek, slender arms trembling as she lifted the heavy buckets. He noticed the care she took with each step, refusing to complain. He watched her knead dough on his rough table, flour smudging her bruised cheek. Her face held fierce concentration, the kind born from years of doing without help. She carried herself with quiet endurance, but the harm done to her was visible to any man willing to truly look. One afternoon, as she reached to hang one of his freshly washed shirts on the line near the cabin, her dress shifted across her back. That was when he saw them. Faint silver marks, thin as lightning scars, etched across her skin. Old wounds. He looked away at once, his jaw tightening as cold anger curled deep in his gut. Those were not the marks of chance or misfortune. She, in turn, seemed to study him in moments she thought unnoticed. She avoided his gaze, yet he felt her eyes on him when he turned his back. She was learning the shape of his silence, the weight he carried, the exhaustion that clung to him like trail dust. They were two wounded creatures pacing the edges of the same cage, held together by floodwater and circumstance. On the third day, Caleb returned to the cabin more quietly than usual. Inside, he found her seated at the table with her back to the door. Her shoulders trembled with silent sobs. In her hands lay a small silver locket, tarnished with age. He stopped just inside the threshold, unseen. He couldn't see the image within, but he watched the way her thumb traced the edge. Slow, reverent, heavy with grief. He should have turned away, left her to that private sorrow. Instead, his feet refused to move. He scuffed his boot deliberately against the floor. She startled, snapping the locket shut and wiping fiercely at her eyes. When she turned, her face was composed, barely. "Mr. Rourke." He didn't acknowledge her tears. He crossed to the stove, movement stiff. "Something wrong?" His back remained to her. "No," she said quickly. "It's nothing. Just a foolish memory." She tucked the locket back into her bodice, hiding it from sight. He heard her draw a shaky breath. He had his father's eyes. she murmured. So softly he nearly missed it. Then she said nothing more. She did not explain who he was, and Caleb did not ask. He knew better than to pry at a wound still bleeding. But the image of her bent over a child's photograph lingered with him long after. The outside world intruded on the fourth day. Caleb saw the rider long before he reached the corral, a lone figure moving across the open land. Instinct tightened his gut. May saw him too. Fear flickered across her face. "Who is that?" she asked. "Cole Mercer," Caleb replied. "Works the main spread. He won't trouble you." Cole rode up, lanky and sunburned, talking before his boots hit the ground. "Rourke," he called. "Figured I'd check whether the river swept you clear to Nebraska." He swung down and froze slightly when he noticed May standing uncertainly in the cabin doorway. He pulled his hat off. "Ma'am." "Cole," Caleb said sharply. "What do you need?" Cole's eyes darted between them, curiosity plain. "Boss wanted to know if you're short on supplies. I'm heading toward town. Bridge is gone, but Flat Rock Crossing's still passable if you're careful." He leaned closer, lowering his voice, but not enough. "Town's buzzing," he added. "About her." He tipped his chin subtly toward the cabin. May flinched and retreated into the shadows, though the door remained ajar. Caleb's eyes hardened. "About what?" he asked. "The widow," Cole said. "May Holloway. Folks say her husband, Vernon Hale, didn't just pass peaceful-like." He leaned in further. "Say he got himself killed over cards at the saloon, owed money to rough men." Then, quieter still, "They're saying she's trouble, that the land's been seized and she fled before dawn." Caleb's expression didn't change. "People ought to mind their own business." Cole shrugged. "You know how it goes. Talk's all they've got." He hesitated. Marshall posted notice on the claim. Creditors own it now. Seems she didn't have proper papers anyway. Only then did Cole register the dangerous stillness in Caleb's posture. "Well," he muttered, stepping back. "Best I be riding on." "Need anything, Rourke?" Cole called. "No," Caleb answered. The word came out sharp as frostbite. Cole tipped his hat again, glancing briefly toward the cabin. "Ma'am." Then he swung into the saddle and rode off, leaving behind a silence that felt tainted. Caleb stood there long after the rider disappeared, staring into the open land. The talk had been ugly, but it carried the weight of truth, the kind of story the frontier produced far too often. He turned back inside. May stood near the cold hearth, arms wrapped around herself. Her face was drawn, colorless. She didn't meet his eyes. "He was right," she said at last, her voice flat and hollow. "What that man said. It's all true." Caleb leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms. He waited. "Vernon Hale did die in a fight," she said quietly, staring at the floor. "He was drunk. He always was, near the end." She swallowed. "The men he owed? They weren't decent men. They came the morning after he was buried. Told me I had 3 days to be gone." She lifted her gaze then. Tears shimmered, held back by sheer will. "And what he said about the land. That's true too. I had no legal right to it." Her voice dropped to nearly nothing. "Our marriage wasn't formal." She drew a breath. "We were wed by a traveling preacher on the trail west, just before I learned I was carrying a child." She pressed her hand to her chest. "Vernon said he'd file the papers. He always said that. But he never did. So to the law," she whispered. "I was never his wife." just the woman who lived with him. The shame in her words filled the cabin like smoke. Caleb saw her then not as a widow, but as something far more exposed. A woman cast adrift, no name the law would honor, no protection any man was bound to respect. Her confession hung between them, fragile and heavy. "Promises," Caleb said at last, his voice low. "They're just words, easy to break." He pushed off the doorframe and moved to the small window, staring toward the jagged line of mountains beyond the trees. "I was 19 when I went to war," he said. "Left my younger brother behind, Luke. He was 17, all fire and foolish courage. Wanted to follow me. I told him no." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I told him to stay, to look after our folks and Abigail Reed. I promised her I'd be home in a year." He paused, the memory thick in his throat. The war wasn't a year. It was 4. He exhaled slowly. "I saw things a man shouldn't see. Did things a man shouldn't have to do. I wrote home. Then the letters stopped coming." He turned from the window, storm-gray eyes meeting hers. "When it finally ended, I went back. Luke hadn't listened. He enlisted a year after me." His voice hardened. "Died of dysentery in a Virginia camp. Never saw a single battle." He swallowed. "And Abigail? She didn't wait. Married a merchant a year before I came home. Had a child with him." A bitter breath left his chest. "She said she thought I was dead. Maybe she did. Or maybe she'd simply grown tired of waiting on a promise. I came back from the grave," he said quietly, "to find my brother buried and my future living in another man's house." Silence followed, but not the empty kind. It was full. 2 broken histories resting between them. 2 lives shaped by loss and betrayal. For the first time, May looked at him not as a rescuer or a danger, but as someone who understood grief's language. That night, a cold wind rolled down from the peaks, rattling the cabin walls. May barely touched her supper. Caleb noticed the unnatural brightness in her eyes. By the time they lay down, she was trembling violently. Her skin burned beneath his hand. "You're fevered," he said. "It's just a chill," she insisted, teeth chattering as she pulled the blanket tighter. But it wasn't. As the night deepened, the fever rose. She tossed restlessly on the narrow cot, murmuring words he couldn't make out. Caleb stayed beside her, a basin of cool river water and a damp cloth in his hands. He did not sleep at all. Caleb cooled her skin again and again, pressing the damp cloth to her brow and wrists, willing the heat to ease. The fire was his only company, its glow throwing restless shadows across the log walls. In the deep hours before dawn, her movements slowed. At first, he believed she had finally found peace. He reached out, testing her forehead. His hand was rough from years of work, yet he touched her with care. Her eyelids fluttered open. For a brief moment, her gaze was clear, steady and aware. She looked at his hand resting against her skin, then lifted her eyes to his face above her, framed by firelight. There was no fear in her expression. Her fingers, hot and trembling, rose and closed around his wrist. The strength of her grip startled him. A faint, sorrowful smile curved her mouth. "You're the only one," she whispered. Her voice was thick, broken by fever. "The only one who's touched me, without wanting something in return." The words struck him harder than a fist. Caleb went utterly still. His palm remained on her brow. Her fingers stayed wrapped around his arm. He had dragged her from the river, cleaned the blood from her skin, sat beside her through the night. Simple acts, necessary ones, nothing more. Yet in her world, He understood now with a sick tightening in his chest. Such care was something rare, almost unimaginable. The pale scars on her back flashed through his mind. So did her whispered question from that first night. A touch without a price. She drifted back into restless sleep, but her words lingered, burning behind his eyes long after her breathing evened. Caleb did not sleep again. He sat by the fire until the coals dimmed, the weight of her quiet confession pressing against him, reshaping something he hadn't known could still change. When dawn came, the fever broke. He stirred from a shallow doze to find the cabin washed in pale morning light. May lay still on the cot, her breath slow and steady. Her skin was cool. The danger had passed. Relief washed over him, deep and sudden. So unfamiliar, it left him shaken. He rose stiffly and stepped outside, needing air. The river no longer thundered. Its voice had softened to a dull, steady rush. The flood was retreating. She would be able to leave soon. The thought should have eased him. Instead, it left an unexpected hollow ache beneath his ribs. Caleb walked down to the riverbank. The water remained swollen and brown, but the violence was gone. He stood there a long while, watching the current pull itself back toward its bed. Footsteps stirred the grass behind him. He turned. May stood a few paces away, barefoot on the damp earth. She wore his old army shirt, the faded blue one from the war. It hung loose on her slight frame, sleeves rolled clumsily at the elbows, hem brushing her thighs. Her hair lay unbound around her shoulders, dark and wild in the morning light. With the mountains behind her and mist curling near the water, she looked almost unreal, like something the land itself had shaped. She said nothing, only watched him. Her green eyes were clear now. The fear was gone, the guarded hardness stripped away. What remained was something fragile, hopeful, asking without daring to demand. "The river's falling," Caleb said quietly. She nodded. "I know." Silence settled again between them, cool and gentle as the morning air. Then she stepped closer. "Caleb," she said, his name spoken for the first time. Her voice was soft, nearly lost beneath the river's murmur. "May I stay a little longer?" The question hovered between them like mist rising from the water. It wasn't truly about the river. It was about him. For a long moment, Caleb did not answer. The part of him that had spent 10 years learning how to be alone screamed for him to say no. He should have told her no, sent her on her way, and returned to the familiar silence that had ruled his life for years. The quiet he had carved out with discipline and distance. But the man who had sat through the night cooling her fevered skin, the man who had heard her speak of a world where even kindness came with a cost, could not force the word from his throat. Instead, he gave a short, uneven nod, his gaze locked on the distant ridgeline. "The crossing will stay dangerous a few more days," Caleb said. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by something deeper than reason. It was an excuse, and they both understood it. "You can work for your keep," he added. "I won't have charity under my roof." A small, trembling smile appeared on May's lips, fragile as a wildflower pushing through stone. "Thank you, Caleb." And so, a new season began in the little cabin beside the Wind River. Not one marked by months or weather, but by the quiet shift of two wounded hearts. The floodwaters slowly withdrew. The river's roar softened into a steady, companionable murmur. But May remained. She slipped into the rhythm of his days, as though she had always belonged there, filling spaces he had never realized were hollow. She worked without complaint, without hesitation. The cabin, once steeped in old coffee and grease smoke, began to carry the scent of warm bread and slow-cooked stew. When Caleb returned from riding the fence lines, dust-caked and tired, there was food waiting. A simple miracle he hadn't known he'd been missing. She tended the garden with fierce patience, coaxing life from stubborn ground. She mended his clothes by firelight, stitches so neat they nearly vanished, her brow furrowed in concentration. The silver locket stayed hidden beneath her collar. Their companionship grew in quiet ways, through shared labor and unspoken understanding. They spoke little, yet a language formed between them all the same. In the bucket of fresh water he left by the door each morning. In the cup of hot coffee she sat near the hearth before he rose. In the glance exchanged across the table that said more than words ever could. For the first time since the war, Caleb felt the sharp edges of solitude begin to dull. Her presence was a steady warmth, pressing back against the cold weight of memory. Yet comfort brought awareness. A thin wire stretched tight between them. The cabin was too small for two people to live within it without brushing against one another. A hand grazing his as she took a plate. Their shoulders touching near the stove. Each accidental contact sparked something low and dangerous in his gut. A heat that both comforted and shamed him. He was a man long unused to a woman's nearness, and his body responded with instinctive hunger his mind rebuked. He felt it most in the unguarded moments. One hot afternoon, he returned to the cabin for water and saw her by the creek. Sleeves rolled high, she washed her arms beneath the clear run, letting the cool current glide over her skin. Sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods, scattering across her dark hair and the gentle curve of her neck. Water slid down her forearms, catching light like shards of glass. It was an innocent moment, and it struck him with startling force. Desire flared, sharp, sudden, unwelcome. He turned away at once, heart pounding, ashamed of how easily the thought had risen. She was a guest, a woman he had sworn to shelter. She was not his to want. May, meanwhile, began to explore the cabin as if learning a new world. Always careful, always respectful, but curious in a quiet, human way. One rainy afternoon, when the land beyond the door blurred into gray, she discovered the small wooden chest at the foot of his cot. It wasn't locked. Inside, beneath his folded army shirt, lay a bundle of letters bound with fraying twine. His war letters, those he had written home, and the few he had received before the silence came. He entered soaked from the rain and found her sitting on the floor, the packet resting carefully in her lap. She wasn't reading them, only holding them. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, looking up. "I wasn't prying. I was just cleaning." Caleb didn't raise his voice. He removed his wet hat and hung it on the peg, movements slow, heavy. "It's all right. These are from your brother," she said softly, touching one envelope written in a different hand. A younger hand. She studied the faded ink, the careful letters of a boy trying to sound grown. "You said he died in a camp." "He did," Caleb said. His voice held no emotion at all as he began wiping down his rifle. The slow, practiced motions formed a barrier, something solid to hide behind, while memory stirred too close. "You must feel—" May began, then stopped, uncertain how to finish the thought. "I don't feel anything about it anymore," he said. It was a lie, and she knew it. Her gaze moved from the letters to his face. Something new settled into her expression, understanding. She was beginning to see the shape of what haunted him. His solitude was not built only from grief. It was built from guilt, from the unbearable weight of a promise he believed he had failed to keep, from being the one who lived. She lifted one of the letters he had written himself, the paper worn soft along the folds. "Would you "Would you read one to me?" she asked quietly. The request was gentle, intimate, so unexpected it caught him off guard. His first instinct was to refuse, to take the letter back, tuck it away, close the chest and seal the past inside again. But he looked at her, at the honest compassion in her eyes, and found he could not. He accepted the letter with stiff fingers and lowered himself heavily into the chair across from her. When he unfolded the page, the handwriting of a 20-year-old boy stared back at him. A stranger, a ghost. His voice came out rough as he began. "Dearest mother." The words felt foreign on his tongue. "The marching has been hard. It rains most days. The mud is a constant enemy. It'll steal the boots right off your feet if you're not careful. The food's poor, but we manage." He skipped the parts about the fighting, the blood and terror he'd once tried to soften for home. He read instead of cold nights, of boredom, of longing for warmth and rest. Then his voice faltered. "I worry about Luke." His last letter sounded too eager, too proud of the idea of war. His throat tightened. "There is no glory here, Mother. Only noise and fear. Please tell him to stay. Tell him his brother needs him safe at home. That is all the honor I require." He stopped. The plea, old and useless, lodged hard in his chest. He folded the letter. The silence that followed filled the cabin like heavy smoke. May did not speak. She only reached out and rested her hand on his arm. The touch was warm, steady, not pity, understanding. And with that single gesture, another layer of the wall around his heart quietly collapsed. A week later, the weather had turned clear and hot. May moved more easily now, her limp nearly gone. Color had returned to her cheeks, and confidence followed close behind. She watched him one afternoon as he worked with his horse, a broad-shouldered buckskin named Ash. Caleb noticed the longing in her eyes. "I miss it," she said softly as he brushed the horse's flank. "The feeling of riding away from everything." "You can take him," Caleb said before thinking. "Just stay near the flat ground by the river. He's gentle." Her face lit with a gratitude so pure it made something tighten painfully in his chest. He helped her mount, his hands firm at her waist as he lifted her up. She was light, lighter than he expected. The brief contact sent a sharp jolt through him. He stepped back at once, his expression turning hard. "Be careful," he said roughly. He watched her ride off, back straight, hair slipping loose from its braid and streaming behind her in the wind. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked free. Caleb returned to his work, but part of him followed her downriver, a restless unease humming beneath his skin. An hour later, that hum exploded into panic. He was splitting logs when a shrill, terrified whinny cut through the air. Ash. Caleb dropped the axe and ran. His heart slammed against his ribs as he vaulted the fence and sprinted toward the sound, his mind filling with every terrible possibility. He found them in a shallow ravine, hidden by a stand of aspens. Ash stood several yards away, trembling, reins snarled in sagebrush. May lay half buried in loose dirt and broken stone where the edge of the ravine had collapsed. She was struggling to push herself upright. Her face was ghost pale, streaked with dust and fear. "May!" Caleb shouted. The sound tore from his chest, raw with a panic that stunned him with its force. He slid down the embankment, stones skittering beneath his boots, and reached her in seconds. His hands seized her shoulders, hauling her fully upright. "Are you hurt? Did you break anything?" he demanded, his palms moving over her arms and back, searching with frantic urgency. "No, I think I'm all right," she gasped. Her whole body trembled. The ground it gave way. Ash snorted nearby, sidestepping nervously. May looked up at him, eyes wide and dark with shock. "I'm sorry, Caleb." He didn't hear the apology. All he could feel was the violent pounding of his own heart and the overwhelming relief that she was alive. Only then did he understand how deeply the fear of losing her had taken hold. Without thinking, without deciding, he pulled her into him, hard, tight, her body crushed against his chest as he buried his face in her dust-scented hair. His arms locked around her like iron, as if he could will the world itself to stop harming her. She sagged into him, clinging back instinctively, her arms wrapping around his waist. They stood that way, two wounded souls holding on in the Wyoming wilds. He felt everything, her breath shuddering, the frantic pulse at her throat, the fragile warmth of her body pressed against his. Slowly, reluctantly, he loosened his grip. His hands rose to her face. He tilted her chin up, brushing dust from her cheeks with his thumbs. Her lips parted as she breathed, soft and uneven. His gaze dropped there. The world narrowed to the space between them. The air thickened, heavy with everything neither had dared speak. He leaned in. He wanted to kiss her, wanted it more than he'd wanted anything in years. Then he saw it. Behind the shock, beneath the stirring desire, was something else. Gratitude, obligation, the same surrender he'd seen the first night she offered herself. A woman who believed she owed him, and he couldn't do it. He stopped with his mouth a breath from hers. The struggle inside him was fierce and silent. After a long moment, he closed his eyes, then pulled back sharply. He released her and turned away, gripping Ash's reins to steady his hands. The moment shattered. That night, the cabin felt different. Not peaceful, not companionable. The silence pressed in, heavy and airless, filled with things left unsaid. After supper, Caleb sat by the fire, dragging a whetstone along his knife with tense, angry precision. May sat on the cot, watching him, her hands clenched tight in her lap. At last she rose. She crossed the room and stopped directly in front of him. "Look at me, Caleb," she said. Her voice was quiet, but unyielding. He paused his sharpening, but didn't lift his eyes. "What is it, May?" "You saved me," she said. "You pulled me from the river. You stayed through my fever. Today you ran when you thought I was hurt." She stepped closer. "You've saved me again and again." He finally looked up. "There's nothing to thank me for." "Isn't there?" she challenged. She stood in the firelight, warmth flickering across her face. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the buttons of the old army shirt he'd given her. One by one, she undid them. "Will you stay this time?" she asked, her voice trembling but brave. The shirt slipped from her shoulders and fell to the floor. She stood before him in her thin chemise, her skin glowing softly in the firelight, eyes locked on his, waiting. The faint scars traced her back like pale silver lines, marks of survival, not surrender. This time, it wasn't an offering. It wasn't repayment. It was a plea to be seen, to be met eye to eye, to be wanted for who she was, not for what she believed she owed. Caleb rose slowly. His body was tight with a longing so sharp, it hurt beneath his ribs. He crossed the distance between them in one step and lifted his hands to her face, his rough palms framing her gently, almost reverently. He searched her eyes. Hope and fear tangled there, need and doubt wrestling for breath. God help him. He wanted her. But the words he had swallowed for too long finally found air. "I want you, May," he said, his voice low and broken. "But not because you think you owe me." A tear slipped free, tracing a quiet line down her cheek. Then another. She didn't cry aloud, but her shoulders trembled as years of silence collapsed inside her. She wept for the shame she had carried like a brand, for the men who had taken without asking, for the kindness she had never learned how to trust. At last, her voice cracked open. "When the drought came, back in Kansas," she whispered. "Before Vernon, my parents were gone. There was nothing left to eat." Her breath hitched. The words failed her, but he understood. She had traded the only thing she had left for bread, for one more sunrise. The sob broke free. "The shame won't leave me," she cried softly. "It's all I ever believed I was worth." Caleb drew her into him, wrapping his arms around her bare shoulders. He held her close, steady and unmoving, letting her grief spill out without judgment. When her tears finally slowed, he lifted her face gently. "That does not make you less," he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of the mountains beyond the walls. "That makes you braver than most men I've ever known." Morning came clean and bright. Pale gold light filled the cabin. Caleb woke on his bedroll to the scent of coffee and the soft sound of May moving nearby. The heaviness of the night before had broken, like a fever finally spent. He hadn't slept beside her. He'd kept watch by the fire, giving her the space her confession deserved. Their eyes met across the room. There was no shame in hers now, no fear, only a quiet, waiting stillness. He stood and crossed the floor, stopping just before her. The air between them hummed with everything they had spoken and everything they hadn't. He lifted his hand, hesitating only a breath before touching her cheek. His thumb brushed away the faint trace of a tear. She didn't pull back. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing as a soft breath left her lips. Acceptance. Invitation. He bent slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. The kiss, when it came, held no fire or urgency. It was as gentle as the dawn itself. Her lips rested against his, warm and unsure, tasting faintly of coffee and sorrow. It was not a promise of forever. It was a promise of now. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. Their breaths mingled in the cool morning air. Something settled inside him, deep and unfamiliar, and terrifying in its peace. "May," he whispered, her name like a prayer. She answered without words. She took his hand and led him to the cot. She lay down, her worn calico dress soft against the rough blanket, then shifted to make room beside her. Caleb lay down carefully, his body stiff with uncertainty. She turned toward him and rested her head against his chest, right over the slow, steady beat of his heart. His arm came around her without thought, drawing her close. She was fully clothed, and for the first time in a very long while, neither of them felt alone. He made no move to change their position. This wasn't about hunger or want. It was about shelter. Within minutes, her breathing slowed into a deep, even rhythm. For the first time since the river had nearly claimed her life, May Holloway slept without fear, safe in the arms of a man who had seen her scars and named her strength. That peace lasted 2 days. Caleb was riding back from the high pasture when he spotted a familiar figure galloping hard toward the cabin. The urgency in the rider's posture set his nerves tight at once. Cole Mercer. May was outside, hanging his freshly mended shirts on the line. She saw the rider too, and a shadow crossed her face. "Trouble?" she asked quietly as Caleb came to stand beside her. "We'll see," he said. His hand settled, without thinking, near the worn grip of the pistol at his hip. Cole pulled his horse to a dusty halt, chest heaving, expression grim. "Rourke, ma'am." He tipped his hat toward May. "I came as fast as I could. I was in town for supplies." "Heard what?" Caleb asked. Cole swallowed. "There's a man in Lander asking questions about the widow Holloway." May stiffened. "He says his name's Briggs Hale," Cole continued. "Brother to Vernon." The color drained from her face. "Briggs," she whispered. "He's telling folks you ran off with a strong box of money that belonged to his family," Cole said. "Says you stole it and disappeared." "That's a lie," May said, her voice shaking. "There was no money. Nothing but debt." "Maybe so," Cole said gently, "but he tells it real convincing. And the sheriff's listening." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Briggs is painting you ugly," Cole went on. "Claims his brother took you in when you had nothing, and you repaid him with betrayal." May swayed slightly. Caleb caught her by the arm before she fell. "He won't stop," she said, terror hollowing her voice. "He always hated me. Said I was beneath him." "Let him talk," Caleb said, his voice low and hard. "We're going to town." She looked at him. "We'll speak to the sheriff ourselves," he said. "Let the law sort it." The words sounded thin even to his own ears, but they were all he had. He saddled Ash, then a quieter mare used for packing. The ride to Lander stretched long and tight beneath the open sky. May rode close beside him, her silence heavy. Caleb scanned every ridge and cut in the land, his hand never straying far from his gun. Lander rose from the plain in a jumble of clappered buildings and churned mud, loud, restless, smelling of sweat and judgment. The sheriff's office squatted near the center of town. Inside, a thick-necked man with a stained vest and drooping mustache sat behind a cluttered desk. He looked up slowly as they entered, his eyes lingering on May with open appraisal. "Sheriff Wyatt Boone," Caleb said evenly. "My name's Caleb Rourke. This is Mrs. May Holloway. We're here to clear up a misunderstanding." Boone leaned back, his chair creaking. He picked at his teeth with a sliver of wood. "Holloway, huh?" he drawled. "Been hearing that name plenty today." May lifted her chin. "Your brother-in-law was just here," Boone continued. "Fine, respectable man. Says you ran off with his family's inheritance." "He's lying," May said. Her voice trembled, but it held. "There was no inheritance. My husband left only debt. That ain't how Briggs Hale tells it," Boone replied lazily. Then his gaze slid to Caleb. "And who are you supposed to be in all this, Rourke?" he said. "I know you." "The quiet man from the river," Sheriff Wyatt Boone said dryly. "Looks like you finally found your voice, and a heap of trouble to go with it." "I found May Holloway half dead in the Wind River," Caleb Rourke replied. His patience was wearing thin. She was running for her life. This man, Briggs Hale, is twisting the law to hunt her down. Boone gave a short, humorless snort. "Hunt her down, or seek justice. Depends how a man looks at it." He leaned back in his chair. "Hale's got two witnesses, men who claim they saw her loading a heavy strongbox into her saddlebags the night she fled." May stiffened. "He says you were his brother's woman," Boone continued. "Not his wife." and that you took what didn't belong to you." Then he leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his eyes sharpening. "From where I'm sitting, I see a grieving brother trying to settle his family affairs. And I see a woman with a questionable reputation. Runs off in the night and ends up living with the first man who'll have her." His gaze slid toward May, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. "Doesn't look good, ma'am." Color rushed up her neck. "That isn't what happened," she said, her voice shaking. "We're telling you the truth." "You'd take the word of a greedy liar over hers?" Caleb snapped, his tone dropping to something dangerous. "I take the version that makes sense," Boone replied, rising slowly from his chair. He was a large man, thick through the shoulders, and he used his size deliberately as he stepped closer. "And right now, his story makes a damn sight more sense than yours." He folded his arms. "My advice, Mrs. Holloway, is to turn yourself in. We'll hold a hearing. If you're as innocent as you claim, you've got nothing to fear." Then his eyes cut back to Caleb. "And my advice to you, Rourke, stay out of it. This woman's trouble. They always are." Caleb stood rigid, his fist clenched at his side. In the sheriff's eyes, he saw something he recognized all too well. The same smug certainty he'd once seen in officers who sent boys to die over lines scratched on maps. There was no justice here. The law was just another weapon, and it was aimed straight at May. Without another word, he turned and seized her hand. "We're leaving." He pulled her from the office and out into the hard glare of afternoon sunlight. Her face was pale, emptied of hope. The fragile belief they'd carried into town had died inside that dusty room. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Her voice sounded hollow. "We ride," he said, his mind already racing. "We can't go back to the cabin. That'll be the first place they look." They retrieved their horses and rode out of Lander. Not north, not home, but south toward the open, rolling plains where the land stretched wide and empty. By dusk, they took shelter in the remains of an abandoned homesteader's barn, a collapsed, forgotten frame miles from any main trail. It barely stood, but it broke the wind and offered concealment. Caleb built a small, smokeless fire in the corner. Its weak glow pushed back the vast, crushing dark of the prairie. They ate their last biscuits in silence. The truth settled in around them, heavy and suffocating. The law was against them. A posse would likely follow. They were fugitives now. Suddenly, May began to cry, not the quiet, swallowed sobs he'd heard before, but something raw and unrestrained. Grief and terror surged out of her all at once, a storm she'd been holding back for years. She curled into herself on the hay-strewn floor, her body shaking with violent sobs. Caleb dropped beside her, his chest tightening painfully. He placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, then turned toward him, her face broken open with despair. "He was right," she choked. "The sheriff. He was right." "May, stop." "No," she cried, her voice rising. "You don't understand. You don't know everything." She pushed herself upright, eyes blazing in the firelight. "You think you saved some poor innocent widow," she said fiercely. "But you don't know what he did to me." Her breath hitched. What Vernon Hale did. And then the words began to spill, fast, desperate, unstoppable, as the truth she'd buried for too long finally broke free. A flood of truth finally broke free. Poison she had carried alone for far too long. "He didn't just gamble," May said, her voice falling to a torn whisper. "When he drank, Vernon became something else. Her fingers shook as they brushed her back. These scars, he gave me every one of them. For burning the bacon, for speaking to a man at the store, sometimes for nothing at all. Caleb listened without interrupting. His face had gone hard as carved rock, but inside him something violent and uncontrollable was rising. Then she pulled the locket from beneath her dress and clutched it tightly. "My baby," she sobbed. "Our son, Noah. He would have been nearly 2. Her breath broke. That first winter was cruel. We barely had food. I was weak, sick. Her voice faltered. One night he was angry because I couldn't get up. He struck me, here. Her hand pressed against her belly. I lost the baby the next day. Silence crashed down between them. He told everyone it was the winter, she whispered. But it wasn't the cold, Caleb. It was him. The truth lay exposed at their feet, ugly, brutal, unbearable. Then she spoke again, barely audible. The money. There was some. Not a strong box, just a small canvas pouch. She swallowed. Coins I saved for years. $1 here, a few cents there. Money from mending clothes for other women. It was my escape. It was meant for me and Noah. Before. A tear slid down her cheek. After he was gone, it was all I had left. And Briggs knew about it. That's what he wants. She fell silent at last and looked up at Caleb. Her eyes were empty, braced for disgust, for judgment, for rejection. He gave her none of it. Instead, he studied her the way a soldier studies another who has survived an impossible war, not broken, enduring. He reached out and gently took her hand, the one clenched around the locket. Her fingers were ice cold. He didn't offer empty comfort. He didn't promise the world would be kind. He pressed her hand against his chest instead, right over his heart. Let her feel it, strong, steady, alive. If they come for you, Caleb said quietly, his voice low and unyielding, they'll have to come through me first. In those words, she heard something deeper than protection. She heard allegiance. He wasn't rescuing her. He was choosing her. The tears that filled her eyes this time were different. Clean, shattering, free. She leaned forward and kissed him. This kiss carried no hesitation. It was fierce and aching and full of recognition. 2 souls saying, I see you. I am here. He eased her back into the hay, the firelight trembling across their faces while the world beyond the barn disappeared into darkness. His touch was slow, reverent. When he brushed the scars along her back, it wasn't with hunger, but with honor, with quiet awe for the woman who had survived what should have destroyed her. She trembled beneath him, not in fear, but in release. This was not barter, not debt, not shame. It was connection. 2 broken lives finding each other in the dark, clinging not out of desperation, but out of choice. And in that abandoned barn, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, something new was forged between them. Not safety, but truth. Healing settled between them like a quiet breath. May lifted her face to his, into the storm-gray eyes where she saw her own reflection, and the truth slipped free before she could stop it. You're the only man, she whispered, wonder trembling in her voice, who's ever made me feel alive. What followed their joining in the abandoned barn was not shame, nor uneasy silence, but a deep, unspoken unity. The danger beyond those broken walls still existed, yet something solid had formed between them, tempered by truth and confession. As dawn brushed the dust-filled air with soft streaks of rose and gray, Caleb Rourke studied May closely. Not as a woman marked by pain, but as someone forged by it. "We don't run anymore," he said at last, his voice low and steady in the morning stillness. "We stand our ground." May Holloway, who had spent her entire life fleeing, looked at him, at the resolve in his jaw, at the fierce, protective fire in his eyes. And for the first time, the thought of standing still did not feel like surrender. It felt like coming home. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. "The truth is our only weapon," Caleb replied. "We just have to find someone willing to hear it." They did not return to Sheriff Wyatt Boone. Instead, Caleb turned toward the town's quieter centers of power, the places where truth whispered instead of shouted. He began at the saloon where Vernon Hale had met his end. The room reeked of stale whiskey and worn-down hope. Behind the bar stood Hank Dobbs, a tired man with eyes that had watched too many men ruin themselves. He stiffened the moment Caleb approached. "I don't know anything," Hank muttered before a word was spoken. Caleb placed $2 silver on the sticky counter. "I'm not the law. I just want to know who Vernon owed." Hank's gaze flicked to the coins, then back to Caleb's unblinking stare. He sighed. "He owed men you don't want owing you," Hank said quietly. "Crow's gunmen. They don't collect money. They collect pain." He leaned closer. "And his brother, Briggs Hale, was in here the night after the burial, buying drinks, laughing. Not mourning, celebrating. It wasn't proof, but it was a start. It painted Briggs not as a grieving brother, but as a man circling his prize." Next, Caleb rode out to the neighboring farm near the Hale homestead. He found Eli Carter, thin and tense, repairing a broken fence. The farmer nearly dropped his wire when he saw him. "I saw you there," Caleb said calmly. "That day with the sheriff." "I don't want trouble," Eli stammered, twisting the wire in his hands. "Trouble's already here," Caleb replied. "I just need to know what you saw after May left." The man swallowed hard and glanced toward his modest house. "I saw Briggs," he admitted. "Came the next day with a wagon. Took more than tools." His voice shook. "A rocking chair, a cradle, quilts, women's things, took everything." "Would you say that to a judge?" Caleb asked. Eli Carter went pale. "I can't. He said Vernon sold them to settle a debt. Said he'd burn my barn if I said otherwise." Caleb looked at the frightened man and understood. He didn't push, but now he had something else. A second crack in Briggs Hale's story. With those two truths in hand, Caleb sought the one man in town whose authority might outweigh the badge. Judge Orson Pike, a circuit judge, a veteran, a man with iron in his spine and war behind his eyes. His office above the general store smelled of leather and pipe smoke, shelves lined with heavy books and harder memories. When Caleb introduced himself, the judge's gaze sharpened. He didn't see a drifter. He saw a man who had survived battles and carried them still. He saw a soldier in the judge's eyes. Caleb Rourke laid the story out plain and steady, without heat or flourish. He spoke of pulling May Holloway from the river, of Sheriff Wyatt Boone's prejudice, of Hank Dobbs's quiet admission, of Eli Carter's fear. He did not speak of tenderness. He did not speak of love. He spoke only of facts and of injustice. Judge Orson Pike listened in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had already heard Briggs Hale's version from the sheriff, a neat little tale of betrayal and stolen money. But he also knew the breed of men like Wyatt Boone, and he knew the look in the eyes of men who had survived years of war. You are placing your own name and reputation on the line for this woman," the judge said at last, his voice dry as old parchment. "You are certain of her innocence." "I'm certain of her courage," Caleb answered evenly. "And I'm certain of Briggs Hale's greed. That's enough for me." The judge studied him for a long moment. He saw the unbending resolve in Caleb's gaze, the kind of honor the battlefield hadn't managed to burn away. "The court is not formally in session for another month," Judge Pike said finally. "But given the likelihood of unlawful action, I will review the matter privately." He leaned back. "Bring Mrs. Holloway to me tomorrow morning. Until then, take a room at the boarding house. Stay clear of the saloon and stay out of the sheriff's path." It was more than they had dared hope for. They took a small, tidy room at the boarding house run by Martha Keene, a stern widow with sharp eyes and a fair mind. As they walked through town, Caleb felt the weight of it, the way conversations died when they passed. Whispers followed them like gnats. Some called May a fallen woman who had landed lucky. Others watched her with quiet, uncomfortable pity. It was a corridor of judgment. Caleb placed his hand at the small of her back, not possessive, just steady. May drew strength from that touch and walked on with her head high, eyes forward, refusing to let their poison reach her. The next morning, as they prepared to go before the judge, a cry of panic rang through the boarding house hallway. A young woman, the blacksmith's daughter, had gone into labor weeks too early. She was barely 18. Her husband stood white-faced and shaking. The town doctor was miles away tending a rancher with a shattered leg. Martha Keene wrung her hands. "We need someone who knows what they're doing." May stepped forward from the doorway. "I can help," she said quietly. "My mother was a midwife. She taught me." The widow hesitated, fear and doubt flickering across her face. But another scream from the room ended the debate. She nodded, and May went inside. Caleb took position outside the door like a sentry, turning away the curious. For hours he listened to the sounds within. The calm firmness of May's voice, the young woman's cries, the sharp instructions for hot water and clean cloths. Then came a new sound, a thin, furious wail. Moments later, the door opened. May stood there with her sleeves rolled up, her face drawn with exhaustion, but lit by something fierce and bright. "A healthy boy," she said softly. The young father wept openly, barely able to speak his thanks. The women gathered in the hall stared at May with changed eyes. They no longer saw the woman from the rumors. They saw competence, steadiness, compassion, someone who had brought new life safely into their town. The whispers did not stop, but their tone shifted. They never reached the judge that morning. As May was washing her hands, a disturbance rose from the street below. Caleb moved to the window, and his blood went cold. Briggs Hale stood in the road, reeking of whiskey and fury. Two hard-faced men flanked him, gunmen who carried their weapons like second skin. Crow's gunmen. "May Holloway," Briggs roared upward. "You're out of road to run. Come out now," he shouted, "or we come in after you." Caleb turned from the window, his face set hard as iron. "Stay here," Caleb Rourke ordered, drawing his pistol and checking the chamber with practiced speed. "No," May Holloway said. Her voice shook, but it did not break. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Before he could argue, heavy boots thundered up the stairs. Caleb shoved May behind him, just as the door burst inward with a violent crack. Briggs Hale stood in the doorway, his face twisted with fury, eyes burning with venom. Behind him, two men spread out, Crow's gunmen, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "There you are," Briggs sneered, his gaze locking onto May, hiding behind another man now. "You're coming with me," he went on. "You've got something that belongs to my family." "She isn't going anywhere," Caleb said. His voice was calm, but it carried danger. He stood squarely between them, solid as bedrock. His pistol remained lowered, but his hand hovered close, ready. "Stay out of this, Yankee," one of the gunmen growled. "This is my business," Briggs spat. "She's my business." He lunged for May. Caleb moved instantly, shoving Briggs back with one arm while drawing his pistol with the other. But he had misjudged the speed of the men behind him. The second gunman rushed forward, not with a gun, but with a knife. Steel flashed. Caleb twisted just as the blade slashed toward him. The knife scraped hard against the barrel of his pistol. He swung the heavy weapon down, smashing it against the man's skull. The gunman staggered, but did not fall. He came back low. Pain exploded along Caleb's left side, white-hot and blinding. The blade drove into his ribs. A sharp grunt tore from his chest as he stumbled backward. Blood bloomed dark across his shirt. May screamed. Time seemed to slow. She saw Caleb reel, his face tightening in agony. She saw Briggs Hale's mouth curl into a cruel, satisfied smile. She saw the second gunman lifting his pistol, and something inside her shattered. Fear, shame. Years of silence and submission burned away in an instant. The pistol Caleb had dropped clattered across the floor near her feet. She dove for it. The weight shocked her hand. It felt foreign, terrifying. She raised it with both arms, her hands shaking violently, and aimed at the man who had stabbed him. He was turning toward her, surprise just beginning to form in his eyes. She pulled the trigger. The blast thundered through the narrow hallway. The recoil slammed into her palms. The man cried out, staggering as blood spread across his shoulder. His knife hit the floor. He crashed against the wall. Everything froze. Briggs stared. The remaining gunmen stared. A small woman stood trembling in the hallway, smoke curling from the pistol in her hands. May's eyes never left Caleb. He was slumped against the wall, one hand pressed hard to his side. His face had gone deathly pale. Slowly, helplessly, he slid toward the floor. She thought he was dying. The man who had saved her. The man who had chosen her. The only man who had ever made her feel alive. Dying in front of her. The gun slipped from her numb fingers. A broken sound tore from her throat. She dropped beside him, knees hitting the floor. She cradled his head in her lap, hands trembling as they cupped his face. Tears spilled freely onto his skin. "Caleb, no," she sobbed. "Don't leave me." Her voice cracked apart. "Please, I can't lose you too." She pressed her forehead to his, her whole body shaking with grief. "Please, Caleb. Stay." Footsteps thundered from below. Shouts rose from the street. Then Sheriff Wyatt Boone appeared at the top of the stairs, gun drawn, confusion etched across his face. Behind him stood Judge Orson Pike. His expression was grim and unyielding. He took in the scene at once, the wounded gunman, the panicked Briggs Hale, the blood pooling beneath Caleb Rourke, and the woman holding him as if refusing to let death claim him. The judge's eyes that had weighed men for a lifetime, settled on Briggs. "That is enough," Judge Pike thundered. His voice cut through the chaos like a gavel striking stone. He raised a finger and pointed directly at Briggs Hale. "Sheriff," Judge Orson Pike said sharply, "arrest this man and whatever remains of his hired help. Assault, threatening witnesses, and anything else you deem fit. Sheriff Wyatt Boone, for all his bluster, knew better than to challenge the judge's authority. He holstered his weapon and moved forward, snapping irons onto a furious Briggs Hale as the man shouted protests that no one listened to. May heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to the man bleeding in her arms. She clutched Caleb Rourke, whispering his name again and again, each word a trembling prayer. When the men carefully lifted him from the hallway, his blood streaking dark across the floorboards, she followed close behind, refusing to let go of his hand. Fear hollowed her chest. The days that followed blurred together. Pain, waiting, and slow, fragile hope. When the doctor finally arrived, he delivered news that felt like a miracle. The knife had gone deep, but missed anything vital. Caleb's life had been spared by little more than inches and stubborn grit. They remained at the boarding house. Their small rented room became both refuge and sick room. Time no longer followed sunrise and sunset. It moved by the changing of bandages, the careful drops of laudanum, and the gradual return of color to Caleb's face. May never left him. She learned the geography of his pain, the sharp breath that meant the wound had pulled, the tight jaw that warned of fever. She cooled his brow with damp cloths, fed him broth when he was too weak to lift a spoon, and read aloud from a battered book of Shakespeare Judge Pike had loaned them. Her voice flowed softly through the quiet room, steady and calming. In that fragile closeness, their final defenses fell away. He was no longer only the strong man who had saved her. She was no longer the broken woman who had been rescued. They were simply two people bound by survival, by loyalty, and by a love that had grown without words. At night, she did not return to a pallet on the floor. She lay beside him on the narrow bed, her warmth pressed against his uninjured side. When he drifted into restless sleep, she stayed awake, listening to his breathing, her hand resting lightly over his chest as if reassuring herself that his heart still beat. It was in those dark hours that his ghosts came. The war, long buried, rose again in fevered dreams. He thrashed, murmured orders, reached for a rifle that wasn't there. Sometimes he shouted a name. Luke. The sound carried an old, unhealed grief. The first time it happened, May froze in terror. Then she saw the anguish carved across his face and understood. This wound ran far deeper than any blade. She did not shake him awake. Instead, she leaned close and spoke softly near his ear. "You're not there, Caleb," she whispered. "You're here with me, in Lander. The war is over. You're safe." She described the room, the faded wallpaper, the moonlight on the floorboards, the weight of the quilt. She spoke of the river, of the hills, of a future not yet written. She said his name again and again. Slowly, the tension would leave his body. His breathing would steady. In the darkness, his hand would find hers and cling tightly, as if it were the only real thing left in the world. Her voice became the anchor his solitude had never known. His strength returned inch by inch, first sitting up, then standing. Then, one afternoon, taking his first slow steps to the window, his arm draped heavily across her shoulders. They stood together, watching the dusty street below, life moving on beyond their glass. "The judge dismissed every charge against you," Caleb said quietly, his voice still weak. "Briggs Hale and his men are awaiting trial." May nodded. "I know." The town had changed, not loudly, but unmistakably. The story of the fight and of her courage in the boarding house had spread. She was no longer spoken of in whispers. She was the woman who saved the blacksmith's child, the woman who stood her ground. In the West, that kind of truth carried weight. Women nodded to her now in the street. Men tipped their hats. The blacksmith himself came by with his cap in hand, gratitude written plainly across his face, offering anything they might need. Caleb turned his head toward her, watching as she accepted the thanks with quiet dignity. And in that moment, he knew something had changed forever. His eyes lifted to meet hers. Afternoon light traced the lines of exhaustion still carved into his face, the marks of pain not yet fully gone. But his gaze was steady, clear, open, unhidden. In those eyes lived something raw and unguarded. He looked at May Holloway, the woman who had stayed when he bled, who had held him through fever and darkness, who had faced the ghosts of his past with nothing but patience and the quiet strength of her voice. And in that instant, he understood something with frightening certainty. A life without her would be nothing but silence. He had no ring to offer, no land deed, no savings, no polished future, only the truth of his heart. "I want to wake up beside you every morning," Caleb Rourke said softly, his voice rough from more than injury. "If you're willing to take a cowboy with a scarred soul." Tears filled May's eyes, blurring the man she loved. His words were like him, plain, honest, stripped of ceremony, not a promise of comfort, but an invitation to share life exactly as it was. She thought of her own shadows, the memory of Vernon Hale's cruelty, the ache of the child she had lost, Noah, the girl she once was, starving and desperate, learning too early how harsh the world could be. She carried ghosts, too, different from his, but just as heavy. She nodded once, firm, certain. "Only if you'll have a widow who still walks with too many memories," she whispered. He didn't answer with words. He leaned forward and kissed her, slow, deep, unwavering. A kiss not of hunger, but of choosing, of staying. Sunlight spilled through the window as if bearing witness. They were married a week later, not in a church, but beneath the wide sheltering branches of an old cottonwood along the Wind River, only a short ride from Caleb's former cabin. The same river that had nearly claimed her life, where fear had once ruled. Now it marked a beginning. The water ran calm and clear, murmuring softly like a blessing. Judge Orson Pike officiated, his presence lending gravity and honor to the simple ceremony. The blacksmith and Lily Turner stood as witnesses, cradling their newborn son. May wore a pale blue dress she had stitched herself, the color of open skies. Wildflowers were braided into her hair. She looked not like a woman running from her past. She looked like a bride. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, a quiet joy settled over them, deep, steady, undeniable. Caleb took her hand, his grip warm and sure. Her heart swelled until it nearly hurt. She looked up at him and asked the question that had followed her across every mile of fear and flight. Only now, it held no desperation. "Will you stay now?" Caleb answered without speaking. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierce certainty that needed no vow. He was home. They did not return to the old cabin. With help from the blacksmith and a few townsfolk who had come to respect them, they built a new house on a rise above the river. Small, sturdy, honest. A porch for sunsets, a proper kitchen with a wide window that welcomed the morning light. They built it together, every beam set, every nail driven, each mark in the wood a promise made real. The town's prejudice did not vanish overnight. Some still whispered, some still judged May's past and Caleb's choice. But the whispers no longer reached them. They had forged something stronger, built from loyalty, shared trials, and love that had already survived fire. Slowly, even the hardest hearts softened. The seasons turned. Winter loosened its grip and gave way to green spring. Spring bloomed into long, golden summer days. Their life found rhythm in honest labor and quiet joys. The garden taking root, a healthy calf born, evenings spent reading by the fire. One late summer afternoon, they rode together along the riverbank, the same trail he had once run in terror, the same path she had fled in despair. Now they rode side by side, unhurried. Laughter, light and unfamiliar, drifted between them. Sunlight filtered through cottonwood leaves, bathing the world in gold. As they rode, May released her reins and reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined without thought, easy, natural, belonging. Caleb looked at her, at a face no longer ruled by fear, at a smile born not of survival, but of peace. And in that moment, he knew every mile, every wound, every hard choice had led them exactly where they were meant to be. He smiled back at her. It was not the kind of smile he gave out lightly. It was rare, honest, one that reached all the way into his storm-gray eyes and softened the hard lines of his weathered face. In that single expression, the long shadows of war, grief, and years of isolation finally loosened their grip. That smile spoke more clearly than words ever could. The pain they had each carried did not disappear. The past had not been erased. The scars still marked their bodies and their memories. The ghosts had not vanished, but now those ghosts no longer haunted them in silence. Now, the weight of suffering rested gently between them. Shared, understood, held together within the quiet strength of their love. What once threatened to break them had become something they no longer faced alone. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deep fakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.